Please let me know by raising your hand if you can't hear, hear me well. I'm taller than this equipment is, but I hesitate to sit down because I get a certain natural authority by standing up. As a graduate student working in the Vatican Library during the second and third years of the Second Vatican Council, I often attended the press conferences on conciliar developments organized by the American bishops. As Dignitatis humanae, which was published in 1965, was being composed, I could see it as having new things to say, but was not persuaded by the common interpretation of this newness given at the press conferences. The Americans seemed generally to believe the document was primarily about the church-state question, as John Courtney Murray understood it, and that it ratified their own embrace of pluralism. To me, it seemed many questions coming from the French Revolution and subsequent historical developments in Europe seemed an absolutely essential background for understanding what the document was talking about. It's things like the rights of believers and churches in the face of the modern secular state, and that this was the task of this declaration to speak to these things. A brief historical survey speaks to the question of the novelty of Dignitatis humanae. The language of religious liberty is not really a language of the ancient church. Necessarily, ancient Christians used the word libertas, for as Hugo Rahner noted, the Romans before them had used the word in regard to the Roman citizen, who was to be a free man. Further, the Bible speaks of such things as liberation from captivity. Christ had come to set the captives free. This freedom, as a freeing from sin or from some form of social oppression, was something that happened to individuals. But in the larger picture, Christian life was seen much more in corporate than individualistic categories, as participating, to give it a pre-Constantinian form, in Matthew's kingdom, or then later Augustine's city of God. In the pre-Constantinian situation, we have little reflection on the institutional liberty of the church itself. Even after the publication of the so-called Edict of Milan, not published in Milan, shouldn't be called that. It's nice when people go home. The situation was that Christianity was now simply numbered among the legal religions. When it became the official religion of the empire in 380, although some attention was paid to the implications of this for followers of other religions, it continued to be assumed either that religion was something one had inherited and piety maintained, or that all should follow the official religion. Although, for instance, in the debates about the altar of victory of the later 4th century, discussions did occur as to the status of older forms of religion, about the status of what was beginning to be called paganism, this only vaguely touched on the question of religious liberty as it would be defined from the time of the Gregorian reform of the 11th century. Such a question could not completely come into view until the relation between public life and the life of the individual had been reconceived. But especially Athanasius and Ambrose saw dimensions of the problem, for instance, the need to protect the individual's freedom of choice in religion. This was something insisted on by a handful of the learned during the early Middle Ages, appearing, for instance, in Alcuin's chastisement of Charlemagne for practicing forced baptism of the Saxons. Augustine developed an understanding of freedom that was intrinsically important and had great historical influence. For him, freedom of the will was not something that existed as an end in itself, but as something necessary for love to exist, love's precondition. Indeed, for both Augustine and Aquinas, will is identified with love of goodness. That is, human life was to aim at becoming godlike, at becoming a wise lover, and to this end mankind had been given freedom of the will. This was to be exercised in community, that is, communally, for humans were made for social life. R.A. Marcus, who did spend some time teaching here at Catholic University, quite seriously misinterpreted Augustine when he held that Augustine believed in a neutral saeculum. Augustine was no modern liberal. For him, properly exercised, freedom brings one into conformity first with God and then with neighbor. Freedom exists not to do as one pleases, but as God pleases. Thus, the paradox that the most liberated human is he who renounces his own will at every point where it conflicts with God's will. This, of course, is a paradox only to the person who accepts the redefinition of freedom of the modern centuries. When freedom is less and less understood as a precondition for living a proper human life, and more understood as the very goal of life. Augustine's view is almost the opposite of what probably the majority since the Enlightenment have meant by liberty. Only with the so-called Gregorian reform in the 11th century did Christians come to speak of libertas ecclesiae. Not necessarily the same thing as modern religious liberty, but something at least ecclesiological, centering not on an alleged right of the individual to believe or worship as he or she wills, but on the right of the church to a public life not controlled by any lay ruler. From some time before the historical record begins, the most common form of government worldwide had been what we can call theocratic monarchy. The point for our purpose is that Christianity was born into a theocratic world and has always, like all religions, accommodated to one or another form of theocracy. I'm going to use that literally to start with, and slowly it's going to become a metaphorical term as I get towards the end of the paper. Thus Charlemagne aimed at making Christianity in his lands more uniform as a means of unifying his empire. In the 11th century, some Christians came to challenge the idea that the emperor or king is the highest authority on earth. These Gregorian reformers asserted that since, in principle, the goals pursued by the church in this world, above all human salvation, are intrinsically higher than those pursued by the state, the lower should not rule the higher. The church should be free to live its own life, guiding itself by its own best light. This stance was summarized in the expression libertas ecclesiae, and with it we come to a new stage of the church's life. For the Gregorians, the question was not just what shape the perfection of the individual Christian should take. That tends to be the first question in ancient Christianity. But how society itself should receive a Christian imprint. That is, now that we're all Christians, how do we order our shared life together and not just go off to the desert or something and seek monastic perfection? This was a question of right order. The idea that the church should be free to live its own life lies at the root of subsequent papal thought about religious liberty to the present. We might call this an institutional idea of religious liberty because the principal concern is that the church be free as an institution to follow God's commands. But because most political systems in the modern world, including our own, are expressions of the continuation of lay theocracy that we find passing from the ancient and medieval world into especially Protestantism, religious liberty has tended to take the form of focus on the individual so that when it is spoken of, it is more likely the freedom of the individual that is intended, not the freedom of the church. Thus, much of Christianity collaborates with the lay theocracy characteristic of modern nationalism. What is sometimes claimed to be John Courtney Murray's novel solution of the church-state question actually assumes the centuries-old claim that the state is the only plausible highest authority in matters of religion. The current opposition of the American Catholic hierarchy to the Health and Human Services mandate in the matter of contraception, in large part, is a struggle on the bishop's side to preserve what Gregorians understood to be the distinction between church and state, and an implicitly Protestant and lay theocratic view. I'm presenting Obama now as a lay theocrat. View of the powers of the state, which accepts a state eager to direct its citizenry in all things except the strictly private, to which this theory reduces religion. Only a church more powerful than the lay theocratic state of its day could actually have the freedom of action implicit in the idea of libertas ecclesiae. That is, the notion of liberty of the church always aims beyond itself to something it cannot attain. What I'm saying is always, I'm a sort of cynical historian, always in history the basic conditions of life are compromise. Many times the church has been forced into unsavory alliances, but this does not mean it should have avoided these in favor of a purer life. Christians are called to form a Christian civilization, not in the first instance a pure civilization, but one excuse me, where the Christian message has been brought to bear on the saeculum. With the maintenance in Catholic memory of such things as the 19th century Kulturkampf and of century after century of lay oppressors, one can see why, when Dignitatis Humanae took up religious liberty, many translated this into being centrally about the relation between church and state. But Jaroslav Kupchak was right when he made the point that the declaration is first of all an anthropological reflection about the necessary conditions of the act of faith and the relation of the human person to his own conscience and to the truth. Then Auxiliary Bishop Wojtyła brought with him to the council a Christian personalism that postulated an, I quote, objective relationship between the natural order from which the rights of the person in society are derived and the order inaugurated by the precept of charity, end of quotation. He intervened on behalf of this a number of times, stressing that religious liberty is spoken of in different ways according to the question one is addressing. For instance, toleration, as commonly understood, is inadequate to ecumenical dialogue because such dialogue is to be about the truth. Only adhesion to the truth can bring unity. God wishes all to be saved and to crown all with honor and glory. He gave humans the ability to exercise dominion, and thus they are equipped to exhibit dignity in both this world and the next, ultimately or eschatologically, to be with and like God. Today, this is largely the way religious people would continue to frame their understanding of human dignity. The non-religious are likely rather to speak of human rights in a discourse founded not on a religious anthropology, but on one of the forms of liberalism. But it is not difficult to show the emergence of the one from the other, the transmutation of the missionary impulse of earlier American evangelical religion into the secular internationalism of the rights movement. Benedict XVI has continued the work of John Paul II in building on the understanding of religious liberty found in Dignitas Humanae. Always his emphasis has been on the openness of man as a religious creature to God. This is what confers human dignity. Religious freedom entails not just immunity from coercion, but, I quote, the ability to order one's own choices in accordance with truth, end of quotation. Always he insists that the discussion of religious liberty may not be removed from the context of a natural law ordered to truth, goodness, and God. In order to address contemporary humans, there is an emphasis on rights, and this rooting in nature and the natural law is what makes rights universal and prevents them from expressing only some particularistic viewpoint, such as that of one culture or religion or the will to dominance of the strong over the weak. Most modern people assume that the civil government is the final arbiter of the life in society, and thus the difficulty they have in seeing the Obama administration in its, what I would call, theocratic pretension, to dictate to the church under penalty via the anti-conscience mandate. That's what I would call it, the Department of Human Health and Services mandate, in regard to contraception, as exceeding what any state is meant to do. But there seems also some imprecision as to how the American bishops, among others, have framed this issue when they claim the life of religious institutions is autonomous. That is, it seems to me the bishops actually fall into the language of the opposition at points in some of their statements. The bishops seem so much to speak within a Protestant and American context, and so little to have understood the significance of the preconciliar debates, especially in France, on the relation of grace to nature, that they either take for granted what I would call a fideus separation of church and state, or maintain the two-storied understanding of the relation of faith to reason associated with many forms of Thomism before the Council. A properly understood natural law recognizes that all things, even religious claims, are to be judged by reason. That which violates reason should be removed from religion, and in any case there is no obligation to follow a claimed religious dictate that violates right reason. As I have argued elsewhere in the case of the Santeria cult, it is wrong to say that just because something is part of a religion does not mean that the state cannot attempt to regulate it. Further, governments have, I quote, no choice but then to distinguish between religions and even to favor some religions over others in order to fulfill the state's duty to safeguard the common good. The subtitle of this paper refers to religion and culture. More needs to be said here about culture. In an illuminating essay, David Crawford cites John Paul II. Different cultures are basically different ways of facing the question of the meaning of personal existence. Individual Christians and the church are always found in a wider culture. From the fact that to communicate they must speak some language seems evidence that everything that is human is largely socially constructed. A series, and I was thinking when Adrian asked one of his questions this morning, that at some level the answer to the question was that the main limitations that we have is that we live in history. I mean, I've inherited all the wrong things my family did over the centuries, etc. I've inherited some of the good things that my culture did over the centuries, etc. I have to speak in a language that's been formed historically and so forth. All of these things make the discussion of us as free beings a very complicated discussion that's not always recognized. So, as David C. Schindler describes his father's thought, talk about not being free. Any pattern of life or form of thought that denies the significance of receptivity or indirectly undermines its primacy is therefore a secular logic. In other words, by effectively separating God's being from the being of everything else, then no matter what one's intentions may be, the pattern is an implicit atheism. These are hard but true words, and it would be difficult to deny that by this standard, America is less the religious culture many think it and more an atheistic culture, distanced from the category and primacy of receptivity, that is, from the heart of holiness. Inevitably, the culture or cultures in which the church finds itself influenced it. One of the brilliant achievements of the movies of Paul Thomas Anderson is to show America as a country in which rampant individualism causes deep loneliness and disconnectedness, pushing Americans into various parodies of the family, such as Scientology. Crawford shows how the claim made by Henry Sumner Maine that in the history of the West we have moved from status to contract has been applied in John Whitty's History of Western Marriage, to show that marriage, for instance, has moved from sacrament to contract. Whitty's argument is that in a society undergoing the shift from status to contract, it was virtually inevitable that marriage should be reconceived as a contract. William T. Kavanaugh broadens the argument to assert that all human relations have been taking on a contractual form. It seems to me that we can hardly reverse such developments, even if we realize all their undesirable effects. The best we can do is to recognize that a shift has taken place, try to explain this to others, as Crawford does for marriage, and as Crawford goes on to urge, in this case promote families as schools of love at the center of a Christian counterculture. For, I quote, the family as a domestic church understood as a form of relationality that transforms modern homelessness offers to the world an interior view of creaturely relationality. Unless we are to retreat into the life of a small sect, there is no choice but then to use current language and concepts to make old understandings still live and develop. Hence the engagement with the language of rights beginning with John Paul II. The mission of Christianity in the present moment must be to stay with what the culture has become, pointing out and embodying the alternative of a culture of love so that those around us can understand what is at issue. There has been much discussion of the forms of liberalism present in recent centuries. These forms have varied considerably, but together have tended to reject the social structures that the pre-modern period developed to hedge in and control individuals, such as the family, the village, and the neighborhood. The writing of natural law into positive law, and the idea that humans are limited in what they can control. The inherited structures of an earlier age have tended to be replaced with a state given over ever more control over life. This is our form of theocracy. Thus, liberalism wears down all the cultural limitations that pre-modern humans had erected to protect themselves in a precarious world. Now, by contrast, I quote, culture, rather than imparting the wisdom and experience of the past toward the end of cultivating virtues of self-restraint and civility, instead becomes synonymous with hedonic titillation, visceral crudeness, and distraction, all oriented toward promoting a culture of consumption, end of quotation. What Patrick Deneen sees to be the anthropological assumptions of liberalism conceive of humans as by nature non-relational or autonomous. Neither nature nor humans have a fixed telos. Key now is open-ended progress and transformation. All this has put the older understandings of religious liberty in danger. Further, Wilfred Maclay wonders whether the contemporary doctrine of religious toleration is not a way of making religion edit or soften, religions, edit or soften their most interdictory and exclusivist aims. I have no doubt that this is so. Modern understandings of toleration generally, in fact, aim at shaping religion so that they do not get in the way of liberal notions of what the goods of society are. Therefore, they do not aim, in the first instance, at fostering the ability of churches to govern themselves, but tend to restrict this ability. Obviously, in recent centuries, particularly in the United States, the idea of religious liberty commonly walks together with the idea of the separation of church and state. In American history from the beginning, there had been a variety of concepts, some of them referred to earlier today, ranging from Thomas Jefferson's belittling of organized religion, whatever else he says about other subjects, and desire for a wall of separation between church and state, to the views of a pious Puritan like Roger Williams, also wishing separation, but to protect religion. Probably, from the beginning, the more common idea among the devoutly religious has been that the worship of God is centrally important to human life, and thus involves all areas of human activity, including, or above all, the political. A central duty of government is to protect and advance religion. David Sehat has recently written a book centered on the tension between liberal and Christian, generally Protestant, worldviews in American understanding and practice of religious freedom. He shows that the disagreement over church-state questions at the time of the American Revolution was followed in the 19th century by the de facto establishment of a Protestant worldview. This secured a constitutional protection of religious freedom, but evangelicals did not understand this as freedom of conscience, nor want separation of church and state. But of course, the federal development had involved removing churches from their former public influence to a more private sphere. The overwhelming power of evangelicalism from the early 19th century resulted in such things as, especially through the schools, the attempt to assimilate Catholics by eradicating characteristics of their religious practice that contradicted establishment values. Now, since the issue in 1947 of Everson versus the Board of Education, Strict separationism has been mandated and establishment redefined in such a way as to forbid the preference of religion over non-religion. To the present, rather than admit the errors found in Everson, the Supreme Court has carved out exceptions in a bewildering way. And I would, if I had time, I'd say, and that's because we have a wrong conception of law. I mean, if you think of law as inherited custom, you're going to very frequently be led down the garden road and then try to say, but it's been said for 15 years and we have to say it, therefore forever. I think much preferable for any is the continental legal tradition coming from the Roman law. And many of our problems come from the fact that we're in the wrong legal tradition. One final thought. The New Testament's hope is that all bend the knee to Christ. The doctrine of religious liberty means that we cannot pursue this hope except in ways that respect human freedom. We always must affirm transcendence as a defining dimension of every human life, that humans are ordered toward God, and that the church has the permanent task of preaching the gospel to the ends of the earth, for which task she must be free. Thank you.